My name is Gu Zhao'er. I'm 28 years old. My parents are alive, and I once loved a jerk. No, actually, I'm not sure if I ever really loved such a person. But it seems like I did fall madly in love with a scoundrel named Gu Zhao'er. That's what my parents told me. That's what my friends told me. Even my attending doctor, Dr. Sheng, said so with absolute certainty. I suppose it must be true, but I can't remember. Because at one point, I suffered from a mental illness caused by Gu Zhao'er, and I was forced to lose my memory. The year I regained my memory, I was exactly 25. When I woke up, I found my mind completely blank. Even the sight of my parents crying by my bedside left me indifferent, as if I were looking at strangers. The name Gu Zhao'er became a taboo in my home. After I woke up, my parents only briefly mentioned that we had been in love for 5 years, but on the eve of our wedding, he ran away with my best friend. I couldn't accept it at the time, so I lost my mind. I believed them, because in this world, I only had my parents to trust. Sometimes, as I sat dazed in the hospital bed, I couldn't help but think that this so-called Gu Zhao'er must have been truly despicable. Not only did he take away the best years of my youth, but he also robbed me of my most direct memories of this world. But now, this jerk of a man, I can't even remember him. Even if I wanted to find him, to crush him underfoot, and tell him I don't love him anymore, I wouldn't know where to start. I wouldn't even have the strength to do it. Because I've forgotten how to love him, and I've forgotten how to hate him. After I was discharged from the hospital, my parents moved us to a new home, and I had no objections at all. Because for me, anywhere would be a fresh start. My life's memories only began to reopen from the age of 25. In the 3 years since, the name Gu Zhao'er completely faded into the background of my life, even though he might have once been so unforgettable that he drove me mad. But what I didn't expect was that, although my mind no longer stored memories of Gu Zhao'er, my heart would still occasionally murmur his name, and that whisper could still make my heart tremble with warmth. I think my heart still holds some warmth for him, and sadly, this warmth doesn't seem to be hate. It feels more like love. I don't dare try to remember him again, for fear that I might lose my mind once more. That evening, I accompanied my parents to the supermarket. After we finished shopping, I went down to the underground parking garage to get the car. The garage was dark, with only a few dim, flickering lights providing sparse illumination. I pulled my knitted cardigan tighter around myself and quickened my pace. I've always disliked the dark and oppressive atmosphere of underground garages. They remind me of a vast, hidden mouth lurking in the shadows, ready to swallow anyone who isn't careful, never to see daylight again. Just as I was about to open the car door, I suddenly heard someone behind me call out, "Sister-in-law." The voice was tinged with slight confusion, but mostly with surprise. I turned around and, in the faint light, saw a tall and sturdy man with strong, well-defined features, radiating an aura of righteousness. "Are you calling me?" I asked, pointing at myself, my eyes widening in surprise. He quickly closed the distance between us in a few long strides, his face now lit up with a joyful expression, as if he were reuniting with someone he deeply missed. "Sister-in-law, I really didn't expect to see you here." The man nervously rubbed his hands together. To be honest, I didn't recognize him. I don't recognize anyone from my past. "I'm sorry, I don't know you," I said, pulling open the car door, ready to leave. The man hurriedly grabbed the car door handle to stop me and then hesitantly asked, "Could it be? Have you really lost your memory?" His rudeness irritated me. Or perhaps, it was more that I hated the way he reminded me that I was someone without memories. In the past 3 years, since moving to this new city, with new surroundings and new friends, no one had asked about or cared about my past. I had almost come to terms with the idea of starting over. But with just one sentence, this man doused me with cold water, catching me completely off guard. "Who are you really? If there's nothing else, I need to go. My parents are waiting for me." I angrily shoved him aside, got into the car, and slammed the door shut, coldly cutting him off. The man stumbled back a step from my push. His lips seemed to be mouthing the words, "parents," and he stared blankly at me. Then, Just as I closed the car door, the man suddenly lifted his head, his voice piercing my eardrums. "Sister-in-law, it's fine if you don't remember me, but you can't forget Brother Wang." He was talking about Gu Zhao'er. Suddenly, anger surged within me. I rolled down the window and retorted coldly, "Gu Zhao'er? Why should I remember Gu Zhao'er? The jerk who ran off with my best friend right before our wedding." With that, I stepped on the gas and sped out of the parking lot. In truth, I saw the man's face fill with disbelief and sorrow after I spoke. But I didn't understand it, so I resorted to my usual tactic, forgetting. On the way home, I thought it over and decided to tell my parents about the man I'd just met in the parking lot. After carefully choosing my words, I slowly began. "Just now, I ran into a man. He seemed to be a friend of Gu Zhao'er." As soon as I said Gu Zhao'er, I could feel the atmosphere in the car instantly grow tense. Through the rearview mirror, I saw my mother's back stiffen, and when she spoke, her voice trembled slightly. He didn't say anything to you, did he?" I shook my head. "No, I didn't stick around." My mother seemed to let out a sigh of relief, her body relaxing. Her eyes, in the dim light of the car, were hard to read. Then her voice came, as if from a distant place. She said, "Gu Zhao'er, don't ever have contact with anyone related to him again. You have to be obedient, understand?" I obediently nodded in agreement, and then I heard my father let out a long sigh. He glanced at me deeply before turning his head to look out the window. I suppose Gu Zhao'er must have been truly detestable back then, because my parents are so unwilling to mention him or anyone associated with him. The second time I saw that man was one evening when I was walking home with a colleague after watching a movie. We had just watched Operation Mekong, a popular Chinese film. My colleague was infatuated with the tough guy character played by Zhang Hanyu and insisted that I go see it with him. Unable to refuse, I agreed. But deep down, I was very averse to this kind of movie. There was a scene where Eddie Peng's character sits on a high mountain, reminiscing about his girlfriend who died because of drugs. The ground around him is littered with cigarette butts, and his eyes are filled with sorrow, tinged with emptiness. That single scene made me cry uncontrollably. It was indeed a heavy and moving film, but that particular scene was just a small part of the overall oppressive atmosphere the film was building. It wasn't really the kind of moment that would make most people cry. But I cried. I didn't know why I was so heartbroken. In the whole theater, I was probably the only one who started crying so early, as if I were experiencing a life and death separation. My heart ached, and covering my chest did nothing to calm it. After the movie ended, my colleague even teased me, saying that anyone who didn't know better might think I had a personal connection to the story. I just smiled awkwardly, telling myself that maybe my emotional triggers were different from others. As we reached the entrance to the residential complex, I saw that man again. He was leaning against a tree, a cigarette in his mouth. There was a sense of loneliness and desolation about him, much like the yellow leaves scattered around his feet. Although I had only seen him once before, I was certain it was the same man I had met in the parking garage that day. He seemed to hear my footsteps and turned to look at me, as if he had been waiting for me to approach. I walked up to him and frowned. "What exactly do you want?" The man let out a soft, bitter laugh and dropped the cigarette, crushing it underfoot. "I'm just here on behalf of Brother Wang to see if you're doing well," he said, his voice rough and full of pain. "I'm doing just fine. Please tell Gu Zhao'er that if he chose to be a jerk, he should at least be a classy one. Stop checking up on his ex-girlfriend." I replied angrily. Every time I thought about how I had once suffered from mental illness because of Gu Zhao'er, I was filled with rage. Now that my life was finally starting to brighten after leaving Gu Zhao'er behind, this man kept showing up and forcing me to think about him. "Sister-in-law, it's one thing if you don't remember Brother Wang, but how can you speak of him like this? How could you?" The man's voice was filled with disbelief, but before he could finish, my father's stern voice cut him off. "Xiangjin." My father's voice rang out. I turned to see my father standing in the shadow of the stairwell, holding a yellow trash bag. The man, who was apparently named Xiangjin, looked at my father as he approached and quietly said, "Uncle Gu." My father shifted his gaze to me, gently patting my shoulder. Zhao'er, go on upstairs. Your mother made some silver ear and lotus seed soup, and it's waiting for you. Though my father's voice was gentle, it left no room for refusal. I looked at him, then at Xiangjin, and finally nodded, choosing to obey. In the 3 years since my illness, I could feel my father's love for me, but for some reason, I could never feel close to him. It was as if something was standing between us, something insurmountable, something we both pretended not to see, something we both let be. Just as I was about to leave, Xiangjin panicked and called out, "Sister-in-law, you can't leave." He reached out as if to grab me. "Xiangjin, she doesn't remember anything. If you have something to say it to me." My father interjected, stepping between us. His face was obscured in the darkness, but his tone was more authoritative than I had ever heard it. Xiangjin let his hand fall, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He lowered his head, avoiding my gaze. As I walked toward the stairwell, I kept glancing back, my ears straining to catch any sounds behind me. To me, this man named Xiangjin, though strange, also felt familiar. His appearance marked the first time in 3 years that I began to suspect my parents might be hiding something from me. It was the first time I felt the urge to recover my lost memories. After entering the stairwell, I quickly slipped into a dark corner near the door, crouching down to eavesdrop on their conversation. The distance between us was too great, and they were speaking in hushed tones, so I couldn't make out much. I listened for a while, but my interest waned. Just as I was about to quietly leave, Xiangjin's raised voice stopped me in my tracks. "Uncle Gu, you have no right to fabricate a painful memory for her just to make her forget another." I don't know what my father said in response, but Xiangjin almost shouted in reply. "Is this fair to Brother Wang? Brother Wang didn't run off with Luo Qing. How could you and Auntie be so heartless to him? Luo Qing, she was the friend who supposedly eloped with Gu Zhao'er." Xiangjin's words left me frozen in place, unable to move, as fragments of memories flashed through my mind. But they were all fleeting, except for the image of an unfamiliar man smiling, clear and real. In that moment, I began to tremble uncontrollably. I suddenly realized that the so-called memories of my first 25 years were probably fabricated by my parents, and perhaps my entire life had been a lie. Who am I? What exactly happened between us that made my parents and Dr. Xing so terrified of his name? I stumbled back home, my mother's concerned face suddenly becoming unfamiliar. Her voice buzzed in my ears, but I kept my head down, too afraid to look at her. I hurried back to my room and locked the door. I wrapped myself tightly in the blankets, and even though it was late autumn, I sweated profusely. There was knocking at the door, my parents' voices filled with concern and anxiety, but I remained frozen, unable to move. In a state between sleep and wakefulness, I felt myself floating. I drifted along until I arrived at a slightly run-down KFC. In the back kitchen, an older woman was scolding a younger girl. The girl had her back to me, revealing a stretch of pale neck. Her shoulders were shaking, and there was a soft, whimpering sound. After the woman left, the girl continued to stand there, crying. Her sobs were delicate and small, but they tugged at my heart, as if I could feel her pain. Then a deep male voice came from the front counter. "Is anyone here?" The girl wiped her face with the back of her hand, called out, "Coming," and then turned around. I was struck as if by lightning, staring at her in utter disbelief. Because that girl had the exact same face as mine. Or rather, she was me from many years ago. I followed myself to the front counter and suddenly saw that man. He had sharp eyebrows and starry eyes. His features were deep and well-defined. He wore a simple black t-shirt and army green shorts. Despite his casual attire, his striking looks and bearing made him appear anything but sloppy. Rather, he seemed tall and graceful. He stood there, a bit impatient, tapping his fingers on the counter. When he saw me looking so disheveled, he seemed taken aback, his expression softening slightly before he finally said, "One family bucket." My voice still carried the catch of someone who had been crying, full of sobs as I asked, "Sir, is one bucket enough?" The tall man stood there, watching me, with an awkward expression as I looked so pitiful, and he said, "Well, if that's not enough, make it 2." It seemed that the more I thought about the earlier scolding, the more wronged I felt, and suddenly, I burst into tears, shouting, Two buckets. Is that really enough? Really enough?" With each word, I sobbed. The man seemed at a loss, his long fingers reaching out as if to wipe away my tears, but then he thought better of it and awkwardly withdrew his hand, quickly shouting, "Don't cry, okay? If 2 isn't enough, I'll add another. I really can't eat more than that." My tears abruptly turned into laughter, and then I was crying and laughing at the same time, snot and tears mingling as I tried to comfort the man who was clearly startled by my outburst. Don't be scared. I don't want to cry either." The tears just started falling on their own. The man suddenly laughed, his eyes lighting up with warmth. And as I watched him laugh, I found myself frozen in place, forgetting to cry. Standing before them, I suddenly remembered. That was me at 20, working a part-time job at a KFC in Yunnan. That was the first time we met, and I fell in love with this man at first sight. But I still don't remember who I am, don't remember what happened that made me lose my memory. Oh, and the man who melted my heart with his smile, his name is Gu Zhao'er. He was 23 at the time, and he was a narcotics officer. Suddenly, I felt an itch and a slight pain on my face. The images of me and Gu Zhao'er in front of me began to blur. I wanted to reach out and grab him, but I couldn't move at all, only able to make a faint mm sound from my throat. But no one could see me. Then I woke up, drenched in sweat, realizing it was just a dream. The strange sensation on my face in the dream turned out to be a cat's paw pressing on my face. But I don't remember having a cat. Sunlight filtered through the gap in the curtains. The unfamiliar cat suddenly circled around me and gently rubbed its face against the man lying beside me. That's when I noticed, to my shock, that there was a man sleeping next to me. And not just any man. It was the same Gu Zhao'er from my dream. Startled, I sat up abruptly, causing the blanket to slide off me. The man slowly woke up, his long, thick eyelashes fluttering before he opened his eyes. Gu Zhao'er smiled at me, then moved closer, wrapping an arm around me and nuzzling his head against my waist. His voice was husky with sleep as he asked, "Why are you up so early?" I stared at his familiar, yet strangely distant face, and after a moment of shock, I threw off the blanket and got out of bed. I pressed myself against the wall, keeping as far away from Gu Zhao'er as possible, eyeing him warily. Gu Zhao'er looked puzzled and got up to come towards me, but I stopped him, saying, "Don't come any closer." I heard my own voice, trembling with fear. "Who are you?" Gu Zhao'er's handsome face was filled with worry. He awkwardly approached and pulled me into a tight hug, ignoring my resistance, and patted my back to comfort me. "Erdwa, it's me, Zhao'er. Did you have a bad dream? Don't be scared, I'm here." Gu Zhao'er's voice had a calming effect, and slowly, I began to relax, hesitantly wrapping my arms around his lean waist. But as I calmed down and glanced around, I realized this room wasn't mine. I didn't recognize it at all. And the cat lying lazily on the bed, staring at me. I didn't know it either. So, how did I end up here? With that thought, I shoved Gu Zhao'er away, stumbling as I hurried out of the room. In the living room, my mother was just coming out of the kitchen, holding a steaming bowl of porridge. She gave me a reproachful look and said, "You silly girl. Why are you walking around barefoot? You're about to become a mother, and you're still so careless." A mother? I stood there, still shaken, not quite processing what she said. "Did you forget? Just yesterday, Zhao'er told me you're pregnant." My mother set the bowl down on the table, her face full of affection. Behind me, Gu Zhao'er grabbed my hand, his voice full of concern and confusion. "Erdwa, what's wrong with you?" I shook off his hand, ran over to my mother and grabbed her shoulders, shouting in panic. "Mom, I'm dreaming, right? Why is he here? Didn't you say he called off the engagement and eloped with Luoqing? Mom, where am I?" My mother looked at me, bewildered, and said, "What engagement? You're getting married tomorrow." I felt like I was losing my mind. My ears were ringing, and my head was splitting with pain. I backed away from them step by step until I hit the corner of the wall, then crouched down, hugging myself, trembling. My mother and Shiwang came towards me, their faces full of worry, but they suddenly seemed so unfamiliar. The fear in my heart slowly consumed me. Finally, I screamed, waving my hands wildly in the air. Ah! I sat up, drenched in sweat, and wiped my face, only to find it covered in tears. The room was pitch black. My hands trembled as I reached for the bedside lamp, turning it on. I looked around at the familiar surroundings and finally let out a sigh of relief. It really was just a nightmare. There was a knock on the door, and my parents' anxious voices came from outside. Weakly, I threw off the covers and walked barefoot to the door to open it. My mother's face overlapped with the one from the dream, making me shrink back a little. Seeing my sweaty, disheveled state, my mother took my hand and sat me down on the bed, her face full of concern. Zhao'er, did you have a bad dream? I nodded lightly. We heard you shouting. What did you dream about that scared you so much? My father reached out to wipe the sweat from my forehead. I looked up, meeting my father's eyes, and slowly began to speak. I dreamt of a cat. She was lying on my face, waking me up with her claws. Then she gently rubbed her face against the man beside me. That man was Gu Zhao'er. As I spoke, I noticed the flicker of something in my father's expression, and he quickly looked away. Then I turned to my mother and said, "The house wasn't our current home, but you were there, too. You happily called me to breakfast. You also told me." My mother, nervous, asked, "What did I say to you?" "You told me to be careful of the baby in my belly, not to walk around barefoot, and you said that I was marrying Shiwang tomorrow." I watched as my mother's face turned pale, and I smiled faintly. "Mom, isn't that dream ridiculous? How could you, Shiwang, and I all live together? And when did we ever have a British short-hair cat?" My mother covered her face with her hands and began to cry in front of me. My father sighed, then asked me, "Zhao'er, are you starting to remember things?" I shook my head, my voice soft, my gaze drifting to the window. No, I just remembered Shiwang. At last, I could feel how deeply I had loved this man. In the end, my father said nothing. He helped my mother, who was crying uncontrollably, out of my room. I stood by the bed, dressed in a white nightgown, feeling like a ghost, silent and invisible, with no desires, no past, and no future. The next day, when my parents were out, I found the unknown number that had messaged me that night. I was certain it had to be Xiangjin. When the call connected, sure enough, it was Xiangjin's voice. Xiangjin seemed surprised that I had actually called him back, clearly not expecting it. "Xiangjin, you're the only one who can tell me the truth." I got straight to the point. Xiangjin knew exactly what I was referring to. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, Saozi. I promised Uncle Gu that I wouldn't tell you. The past is the past. You really don't need to remember it." His words snapped the tension that had been building inside me these past few days, and I almost lost control, yelling, "Why are you all lying to me? Mom and Dad, Dr. Xing, and now even you won't tell me the truth." Tears streamed down my face as I pleaded. Gu Zhao'er never abandoned me, did he? Luoqing didn't betray me either, right? Please, I'm begging you, tell me the truth. I'm the one who lived through it. I have the right to know. Xiangjin's voice was choked with emotion. "Saozi, it was because of this that you got sick back then. I can't. I'm fine now, really. Even for Shiwang's sake, I'm begging you, please tell me." Xiangjin fell silent again. Just as I was about to give up, thinking he wouldn't answer, he suddenly spoke. "Have you ever wondered why both you and Gu Zhao'er have the surname Gu?" It felt like a bolt of lightning struck me, and my mind raced through a series of increasingly dreadful scenarios. Then I hung up the phone and stumbled into my parents' room. I remembered that when we moved, I had seen my mother with a locked box. I had asked her what it was, and she had simply said it was old stuff. Now, thinking back, the way she hastily locked it when I walked in seemed strange. I searched through everything, and after a long time, I finally found the dusty box under the bed. I grabbed an axe and struggled to break open the lock. To my surprise, inside the box was just an old, slightly yellowed photo album. Confused, I took the album out, sat down on the floor, and studied myself, mentally preparing before slowly opening it. As I flipped through the pages, my pace quickened, and it felt like a heavy weight was crushing my heart, pulling it down into an abyss. What I found was even worse than my worst fears. The entire album was filled with pictures of Gu Zhao'er, or more accurately, Gu Zhao'er, and the people I had called mom and dad for 3 years. From Gu Zhao'er as a baby learning to speak, to him smiling radiantly in his police academy uniform. I finally understood why I didn't resemble my parents at all, and why there were no pictures of me as a child in our home. I had asked about it once, and my mother had casually said they were left behind in the old city, so the only photos we had were from the past 3 years since I regained my memory. But in reality, there had never been any photos at all. My tears fell uncontrollably. I covered my mouth to stifle any sounds, my mind in turmoil. Past memories suddenly played out in my head like a movie. Various images of Gu Zhao'er, each one of him loving me in his own way. My name is Gu Zhao'er. I'm 28 years old. Both my parents are alive, and I once loved a scumbag. Except for my age. Everything in that sentence is a lie. As painful as it was, there was also a strange warmth in the realization. My name is Gu Zhao'er. I'm 28 years old, orphaned at a young age, and in love with a hero. This is my true life, the one that belongs to me. The people I now call my parents, they aren't mine. They are Gu Zhao'er's. My parents died when I was 15, and Gu Zhao'er wasn't a scumbag. He was an anti-narcotics officer, a hero. And I, Gu Zhao'er, was his informant and also the woman he loved. The KFC family buckets from my dreams really were our first meeting, chaotic, yet romantic. Not long after that day, I met Gu Zhao'er again. He found me and asked if I would be his informant in the drug trade. My parents had been drug dealers, killed in a shootout with the police. I had spent my childhood on the run with them, witnessing a life of indulgence, danger, and thorns. No one knew the drug trade routes and hideouts better than I did, and no one had stronger mental resilience. It was on a sunny afternoon, with a gentle breeze, that Gu Zhao'er found me. Just like in the movie Operation Mekong, when Eddie Pung sits on a high mountaintop and finds his target, Gu Zhao'er found me. I saw the surprise and pity in his upturned eyes. He was glad to see me again, but he pitied my tragic life. He sat there, telling me about his childhood dream of becoming a police officer, about how his parents were strongly against it, about the struggles and joys of police academy, and how his mentor had died in a recent anti-drug operation. I watched his thin profile closely, the faint glimmer in his eyes, and the cigarette butts scattered around him. I knew from the moment he bought me those 3 family buckets that I was infatuated with this man. That day, I stood in front of him, tilted my head slightly, and smiled at him with my eyes curved in a grin. The sunlight bathed him in a soft glow, making him look just right, and I asked him, "Do you like me? If you do, I'll agree to be your informant." Naturally, he didn't agree to be with me that day, but I still agreed to be his informant. Because I didn't hate the police at all, I hated drugs. From childhood, I had a deep-seated hatred for drugs. It was because of drugs that my family was destroyed, leaving me alone, with no one to rely on. I worked with him for 5 years. In those 5 years, we completed countless investigations. In those 5 years, we faced various dangers. In those 5 years, we were superior and subordinate, comrades, friends, and almost lovers, just one thin layer of glass separating us. In those 5 years, Gu Zhao'er brought me the thrill and warmth that I had never experienced in the first 20 years of my life. To me, he was like the oak tree in Shu Ting's poem, and I was like the kapok tree standing close by, standing together with him as an equal. He had his bronze branches and iron trunk, like knives, swords, and halberds. I had my red blossoms, heavy like sighs, yet as brave as torches. We shared the cold, the storms, the thunder. We enjoyed the mist, the clouds, the rainbows. Though it seemed we would always be apart, we were bound to each other for life. I loved Gu Zhao'er, not just because he brought me salvation in the darkness, but also because I admired his unwavering dedication to his role on the front lines of the anti-drug fight, sacrificing his youth without regret. In the 5th year, we finally had a chance to take down the drug ring we had been tracking. During the final operation, a miscommunication nearly cost Gu Zhao'er and me our lives in Myanmar. We were at the end of our rope, trapped between pursuing enemies and a deadly tiger. Gu Zhao'er clutched his shoulder, where a bullet had grazed it, blood seeping through his fingers. His forehead was drenched with sweat, his lips pale, but his eyes were as bright as ever. Gu Zhao'er smiled at me and said, "Erdwa, if we survive this, let's get married." I cried loudly and said, "We haven't even dated yet." Gu Zhao'er kept smiling, as if we weren't on the run, as if we were just chatting. "The first time I met you, you made me buy 3 family buckets, and I almost burst from overeating." I laughed through my tears, watching his lips grow paler, and stopped him from saying more. In that moment, I thought, if we couldn't be born on the same day, in the same month, in the same year, at least we could die on the same day, in the same month, in the same year. That seemed romantic too. But then, just when I was ready to face that fate, help arrived. We were lucky we survived. And back then, I was so happy, thinking that good fortune would surely follow. Gu Zhao'er was bedridden for 2 months after we got back. One of his arms was nearly crippled, but luckily, the bullet missed by a little, and his arm was saved, though he could never hold a gun again. I cried uncontrollably by his bedside, while Gu Zhao'er looked at me with amusement. He said that after all these years, I still cried so easily, and that he felt lucky just to be alive and to stay with me. When he was well enough, Gu Zhao'er took me back to his home. Gu Zhao'er's parents were the best I had ever known. They treated me like their own, caring for me and loving me. Because his arm was disabled, Gu Zhao'er submitted a transfer request to the bureau. He said that in the next 10 or 20 years, he wanted to be a police officer who could stand in the sunlight, openly protecting me, our family, and the nation. I was so happy and touched that day, I bought him a family bucket. Our wedding date was set quickly. 2 days before the wedding, I noticed my period was over a week late, so I secretly took a pregnancy test in the bathroom. When I saw the 2 lines appear, I jumped for joy. How wonderful! I was having a baby with Gu Zhao'er. When Gu Zhao'er found out, he grinned so wide his smile almost reached the back of his head, looking like a complete fool. But I was so happy because I was marrying this fool, and miraculously, I had our child growing inside me. It was the best wedding gift the heavens could give me. I thought that no matter if it was a boy or a girl, the baby would surely be beautiful. I hoped the baby would have Gu Zhao'er's eyebrows, Gu Zhao'er's eyes, Gu Zhao'er's nose, Gu Zhao'er's mouth, and above all, Gu Zhao'er's sense of justice and courage. See how much I loved Gu Zhao'er. I loved him so much that I wanted our child to be another Gu Zhao'er. I thought, after 20 years of misfortune, Gu Zhao'er finally turned my luck around when I met Gu Zhao'er. The day before the wedding, Gu Zhao'er, my best friend Luo Qing, his comrade Xiang Jin, and I went to the hotel to finalize the wedding menu. In the underground parking lot afterward, a man in black suddenly charged at us. I recognized him. He was Mai, one of the escaped members of the drug gang. I saw the gun in his hand, and we had nothing to defend ourselves with. I don't remember what happened next. I only know that when I came to, Luo Qing was already lying in a pool of blood, and there was a gaping, bloody hole in my stomach, but I didn't feel anything. Gu Zhao'er and Xiang Jin were grappling with Mai on the ground. When the bullet hit me, Gu Zhao'er looked at me with reddened eyes and called my name. Then, when he was distracted, Mai pulled a knife from his coat and plunged it into Gu Zhao'er's chest. Not far away, the wounded Xiang Jin witnessed the scene. He managed to grab the gun that had been knocked to his side during the struggle and fired at Mai's temple. By the time the police arrived, alerted by citizens who had heard the gunshots, Mai had already died from blood loss. I lay on the ground, dimly aware of Gu Zhao'er lying lifeless in the distance, his eyes closed, and without a trace of breath. That fear and chill that rose from my feet, I'll never forget it. When I woke up, it had already been a week. Luoqing was gone. My baby was gone. And my hero, Gu Zhao'er, was gone too. In the end, I lost my mind, spending every day crying and laughing, talking about family buckets, and thinking about Gu Zhao'er and the child I never met. 20 years of a miserable life hadn't driven me mad, but Gu Zhao'er's death completely broke me. Now you know how important Gu Zhao'er was to me. In the end, Gu Zhao'er's parents had no choice but to send me to a mental hospital, tearfully begging the doctors to make sure I got better. That's when I met my psychiatrist, Dr. Xing. She had no other options, so she tried hypnosis to make me temporarily forget the first half of my life, the Luoqing I had failed, and the Gu Zhao'er I loved the most. When I opened my eyes again, I was 25 years old. My name was Gu Zhao'er. My parents were alive, and I had loved a scumbag named Gu Zhao'er. To help me completely let go of Luoqing and Gu Zhao'er, and to end my obsession, they told me they had eloped and left me behind. This was the warm lie the whole world had woven for me. When my parents returned home and saw me sitting on the couch with the photo album beside me, they knew that I had remembered everything. My mother, her face pale, walked shakily toward me and hugged me with tears streaming down her face. In my memory, when Gu Zhao'er first introduced me to her, she was still well-maintained and radiant. But now, in just 3 short years, her hair was full of silver strands, and she seemed to have aged 10 years. They must have been such kind and loving parents to change my last name, bring me to a new city, and even to the point of enduring the pain of never mentioning their own son again, just to help me forget him, even if it meant tarnishing his name. I buried my head in her neck and cried, saying, "Thank you. From now on, I am your daughter." My father, who had always been composed, looked at my mother and me as we cried, his eyes reddening as he turned his gaze to the distance. Eventually, I went back to City A with my parents. It was a rainy day, and I stood in the cemetery, dressed in black. Gu Zhao'er's tombstone had neither a photo nor a name, only his birth and death years. That's right. Because he died as an anti-narcotics officer, his death wouldn't have a memorial service, nor a proper tombstone, and his family wouldn't dare to mourn him openly. Who knows if there were drug dealers still lurking in the shadows, waiting for a chance to exact revenge. Gu Zhao'er's profession meant that his family could never find peace during his life, and even in death, they couldn't either. But I was still proud of him. I asked my father, who was standing next to me, staring at the tombstone without moving for a long time, "You loved Zhao'er so much. Why were you willing to create such a false memory for me, letting him bear such a burden?" My father shook his head. The wind blew his silver hair, which was soon soaked by the fine rain. His eyes might have caught some of the raindrops too, I thought. His profession destined him to live in the shadows, unseen. No one remembered him while he was alive, so what does it matter if he bears a few false accusations after death? He said. Just think of it as continuing to serve the people. He seemed to smile a little, then turned to me and said, "The living will always be more important than the dead." He spent his whole life protecting those who are still alive. Before I met Gu Zhao'er, I longed to be cherished, properly placed, and carefully preserved. Free from fear, free from suffering, free from wandering, free from having no one to rely on. After I met Gu Zhao'er, I only wished that this person could be him. But after Gu Zhao'er left, I knew that person would never come again. When Gu Zhao'er died, he was 28 and I was 25. He was 3 years older than me. Now I'm 28 and he is still 28. He will forever be 28. In the midst of the scattering evening rain, I looked at the nameless tombstone before me. I wanted to tell the world that Gu Zhao'er was not a scumbag. He was my hope, my salvation, and everyone's hero. He was an anti-narcotics officer. His name was Gu Zhao'er. Please, world, treat him kindly. Don't forget him.